So we're gonna start the presentation today from Dr. Nchangwi Cynthia Munung, which is gonna be on ethical considerations in establishment and governance of genetic databases. So Dr. Munung is a postdoctoral fellow at the Division of Human Genetics in the Faculty of Health Science, University of Cape Town in South Africa. She is part of the Genetic Medicine for African Populations in Africa research group, which is led by Professor Ambrose Wonkam, the University of Cape Town. She completed a PhD under the supervision of Professor Jantina at the University of Cape Town, looking at ethical issues. And then she joined the Sickle in Africa Consortium, or GeneMap generally, to look at, which is a consortium in Africa that is based on sickle cell disease. And so she kind of leads the ethical issues in that consortium. Without going too much into what Cynthia does, we're just gonna give her the floor to present to us. So thank you, and please post your questions in the chat box as you listen to Cynthia's presentation. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction, and many thanks to you and David and the entire AfriPopGen team for the invitation. But just to confirm that you can hear me, can you hear me?
Yes, Cynthia, loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Great, great, thanks. So it is really a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the invitation. This evening or today, I will present on the ethical considerations in the establishment and governance of genetic databases. And so these ethical issues, there's so many ethical issues, and I don't think I have the luxury of time to go through them in details. So I will just touch on some of them, but consider this presentation more of a reflection as a researcher or as any other stakeholder in genetics research in Africa on what are your own responsibilities. So the first thing also even to reflect on before we start discussing the ethical considerations is that just the issue of genetic databases itself there are so many questions about what it means in its own right. So what are genetic databases? Is that the right phrase or ontology for it? Or should we be calling it something else? But I think that's a question more for genetic researchers to reflect on what that terminology means. Great. So I think the World Economic Forum has done quite some justice with laying out what could be some of the ethical tensions in genomic data sharing or the use of genomic databases. And so they have a document titled Leapfrogging with Genomic Databases, and they highlight 4 key ethical tensions in the use or in the establishment and use of genetic databases. There are issues around consent, there are issues around genetic privacy, data access, and benefit sharing. But much of it is around balancing individual privacy versus societal benefits, or what we may call the public good. It's about balancing the benefits of open and restricted access to data. And it's also about balancing receiving the benefits of genomics data much more broadly at the societal level. When you compare that to the altruistic donations of individual participants. So generally, I love to talk of these ethical issues in genetic databases in 2 broad categories. So the first is the micro level ethical issues, and there you'll have concerns around informed consent. You have issues of privacy and confidentiality. You have issues around stigma and discrimination, and also research integrity. And then at the macro level, ethical issues, which is the second category, I prefer to group these issues. You have questions on equitable partnerships. And I think that has been a huge debate over the past 5 to 10 years. So I'm sure many people are familiar with what's happening in that area. Then there are issues of oversight and equity-based responsibilities, and which is what I would love many of us on this call to think of, like what as we work with genetic data, as genetic researchers, as stakeholders, whether we are funders or participants in research, what are our equity-based responsibilities? And then to reflect on issues around benefit sharing, which could be part of our equity responsibilities, and then questions of intellectual property, which is a huge thing, but I think many people are becoming increasingly familiar with that, with the COVID vaccine issues, concerns around access to COVID vaccines. How do we address these different ethical issues? So I've listed quite a lot of them. And so informed consent is there. And for most researchers, I think we all agree, like that's no longer an issue. We need consent to use data, genetic data, or to even get people to participate in research. But I think for genetic databases, the question now is, what are the acceptable consent models? And I'll talk about that in the next slide. There are issues around data sharing or sample and data sharing. There are concerns there around what consent model should be used, how could it be equitable, and how do we ensure privacy and confidentiality of the donors. Then there are issues of stigma and discrimination, and then broad, in a much more bigger space, commercialization, and that will cover intellectual property, patents, and benefit sharing. And I think that these different ethical issues, irrespective of how we think of them, can be addressed in 4 broad approaches. So you'd have community engagement, and you'd have compliance to regulatory requirements. It will be equitable governance. And I think much more recently, we need, there is a push for a much more patient-centric approach, or a much more public-centric approach. So we should be thinking of what are the best ways or models for public engagement in the use of genetic databases. And so in terms of informed consent models, so the issue of whether we should get consent or not, that's sorted. I don't think it's an issue or debate now. But in terms of consent models, it is about the respect of participants' autonomy. And the question here is, which consent model respects the participants' autonomy? And that's just because genetic this data stored in databases will be used in various forms, apart from the primary research for which they were collected for. So how do you ensure that the participants' autonomy is being respected? And people have proposed different consent models. I'm highlighting 3 here because of their relevance for genetic databases. So there is the tiered consent model, which gives the participant the right to choose the degree of involvement they want. And so they may be able to say, yes, I want to participate in this particular genetic study on diabetes, but please do not use my data for a study on HIV, or use it only for this study. Do not deposit it in a genetic database, or if it's in the database, I want it to be used only in Africa, you know, or yes, it can be used by every researcher, but not by commercial companies. So do you want that the participant to go into that detail? Do you feel like it respects their autonomy to be able to choose? Then there is broad consent, which is saying that they can consent for wider use of their data. And I think many people love to talk of broad consent as consent for governance. And it's saying broad consent doesn't necessarily mean that the samples are going to be used for anything and everything, but that there should be some governance mechanisms in place to ensure that there is responsible use of that data. And empirical studies have shown that there is some level of public trust in the use of broad consent. Like, research participants are generally happy to provide that type of consent. And then there is the other school of thought that dynamic consent may be a better approach, because it really gives participants the choice to be able to choose how their data would be used. And this has come really in force with advances in information technology, and also people argue that it is possible because of the high cell phone penetrance in Africa. So that may be a thing to consider, but I feel it is a good model, because I can be able to say, I receive, for example, a text message or an email to say, we want to use your data for this study on sickle cell, and then I can say yes or no. So every time my data is used, I have an idea of what it is being used for, and I can consent or refuse to participate in that. So it gives the participant more control over use of their data. But I think the bigger question there is feasibility. How feasible is that, especially in resource limited settings, or where participants constantly change their information, contact information. But at the end of the day, irrespective of the consent models that we go for, I think the bigger message for us is, how do we ensure responsible use of information in genetic databases? And this slide, I just want to highlight some work done by the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And I've picked that specifically because the consent forms for the H3 Africa project, some of you may be familiar with, and I've selected that because it's more Afrocentric, have been annotated against this data use ontology. And it's the data use ontology is just saying that in a database, in a genetic database, you can be able to request access, get the permission, and be able to use that data based on the initial consent that was provided by the participant. And so if you look at the slides, there are different modifiers for that. So the original consent form may have said, for my sample, I consent to this, but it should be used just for non-profit use. So if you are a commercial company or a for-profit initiative that wants to use data in a genetic database, then you know that that particular information cannot be used. And so there are different modifiers, or we call them conditions for use or permissions for use. Some will be, they require ethics approval first before you can use that particular data or information in the genetic database. Or benefit sharing, there must be plans for benefit sharing and all of that. And it is really an ontology to consider when setting up a database, because it really sort of ensures that there is responsible use of information in line with the original consent as provided by the participant or the donor of that information. Another point on the responsible use of data or information in genetic databases is compliance to national regulations and laws. there is not quite a lot of countries, or very few countries have put in place data protection laws, but it's fast becoming a thing for many countries. Many countries are working on their data protection laws. For others, those laws are in place already. As you would see on the African map there, which shows which countries have data protection laws or acts, which countries do not, which one has constitutional coverage and all of that. But the bigger thing here is that in most of these laws, they talk about data more broadly. And the bigger question is whether that applies to genetic data as well. But when we look at the regulations for research, for health research in many African countries, there were no, for many countries did not have specific requirements on data sharing. So that is a thing, but most of them did not also say that, most of them would support broad sharing, or did not say that broad sharing was an issue. Broad consent, sorry, was an issue, which sort of gives room to say that perhaps the wide sharing of genetic data and secondary uses of participant of genetic data would be allowable, in quotes, for many African countries. But it is important that when we apply to use, or we use information in genetic databases, that we are sure that the use is in line with the national regulations. But so there, if there is a national regulation or a policy for a particular country that does not really require broad sharing of data, how do we navigate through those issues? Or in case of, in the case where there is sensitive data and people may not want to put it out there, how do we navigate those issues? Then there are also issues where people are not really at the time willing to share data more openly. They would want to keep the data first for various reasons. How do we navigate those issues? So the World Economic Forum proposed a federated governance model, which they say it's a promising way to enable access to health data, including genomic data, that must remain inside a country or institution for any reason, whether it's because of the national policy, or because of the sensitivity of the data, or because there is not yet readiness at the time to share the data. And in this federated governance model, you mainly be using like an API system for sharing data. So it allows you more control of your data. Like so you're able to see who is accessing this data for what, and give access to that data, which means that you can ensure responsible use of the data as a researcher or as a custodian of the data, because you are aware of what were the initial consent models, or you're aware of the national policies and all of that. But key to the federated governance model is the need to establish trust, and also to say what are the incentives for this model, or what are the incentives for sharing data with who is requesting that data. So at the beginning, I mentioned that there are micro level ethical issues, and then there are macro level ethical issues. I've talked about consent. I've talked about responsible use of data. And I just want us to sort of reflect also on the macro level ethical issues, and which at the level of researchers is to think about what models of data sharing would be considered equitable. And I've put this here for this talk because I know that some of you may be bioinformaticians or use data that's openly available. And there is always that quest or desire, like, can you share the data? Can you make it openly available so that people can use? For those who generate primary data, for them, it's like, no, we can't make it openly available like that for whatever reasons, either because we want to be able to fully exploit that data, we want to be able to analyze, we want to be able to publish. But I think for those who use secondary data for their studies, they will go more towards an open sharing model. For primary researchers, there are some concerns. They are willing to go for open sharing, but for some, they'll prefer restricted access at other times. But it's to ask ourselves, what is more equitable? Is it open sharing or is it restricted access? And irrespective of where we sit in the spectrum of the use or the generation of data, it is important to think, no matter what model you advocate for, to think what it means for the other person. So for example, open sharing is really great because it allows for maximum use of that genetic data. A question, for example, would be, what does that mean for early career researchers? So I think people we've talked about what it means for African researchers, and people, and there is a move towards having embargo periods to allow African researchers, for example, or researchers in low and middle income countries who have limited resources, to be able to make use of the data they generate from their projects before depositing them into genetic databases. But also for early career researchers, what does that mean for them? Because for some of them, that is what they will be using to develop their career. If they put it in a database, sometimes it's just fears about someone may be ahead of them and the use of that data. But are there ways to incentivize that such that people are able to openly share their data? In terms of restricted access, we see the importance also, but we need to reflect also for the participants, for research participants or the public who gave that information and wanted it to be used for research to the maximum level possible. Does restricted access do justice to their their initial consent or their desire for their data to be used as widely as possible? And for both models, who benefits? And for research participants, it's about how should data be used? How would they want their genetic data to be used? And for all stakeholders, whether it's researchers, funders, the general public, institutions, I think we should all be asking ourselves the bigger question: should participants or should the general public be given a voice in decisions around the use of their genetic data? And I know that that requires some level of unpacking, like what does that mean and how do you even begin to give the general public or participants a voice? Perhaps when they are in an organized group, like the patient support groups or the rare disease community that's more organized, it seems like it is feasible. But for the wider public, what does that mean? But I think that it is a bigger question we should be asking ourselves at this time, as genetic data databases becomes the norm and a mainstay for genetic research. Sure, I think I'm having issues. Great. Another important ethical issue is stigma and discrimination. And this is especially common with national genetic databases. And that's not to say that in other types of databases it's not common. It's not an issue, but it's likely to happen. So it's common, maybe the wrong word, excuse me for that. to happen in national genetic databases. And it's to say, is there a potential for stigmatization and discrimination? Is there a likelihood that insurance companies and employers may use national genetic databases to make decisions on employment or to make decisions on your medical care package? Is there a possibility of ethnic group harm? So is it possible that a genetic database or a national genetic database, the use of that database for research could lead to an outcome that could sort of stigmatize a particular ethnic group? So it's like saying, could we do research, use a genetic database to do research such that we are able to say this particular population has a high genetic predisposition to developing this condition, and that it is stigmatizing for them or could cause some level of harm. And the third is, could national genetic databases be used for forensic purposes? And this is not far-fetched. I think there are many examples already of how forensic experts have requested access to national genetic databases, and there are questions of whether it should be used for that purposes. And at the end of the day, it's about balancing individual liberties versus the public good. So at what stage do we draw a line that, yes, we understand that this as your individual right to say, yes, I want my data to be used this way, or no, or yes, databases should be used for forensic purposes, and to say, no, we need it for the public good. Then there are broader questions of genomic justice, and I wouldn't go into detail for much of that, but it is around issues of intellectual property and patents. I think for this slide, much links to the commercialization of how genetic databases may be used by commercial entities, especially pharmaceutical companies. And the question there is, should commercial companies who use genetic databases to make profits be able to share that benefit with the donors? And I'm sure you ask, who are the donors? It will be the public. And how do you share that benefit? So those are contentious issues. And another question is, who has ownership of data in a genetic database? And I know that there is a move to say, oh, we could be custodians, we could be stewards of the data. But I think no matter what terminology we use, the issue of ownership still stares at us in the face, because ownership of data has implications for intellectual property. And I think a good example there, it may not be genetic data, but we've seen how use of data more broadly for clinical research or for health research, broadly speaking, raises issues of intellectual property, especially we saw the case of COVID vaccines, where when these issues are not properly addressed, then there are issues of access, like which population is able to get the benefits of scientific innovation that comes out from the use of data from these databases. And these broader issues of broader justice issues in genomics research, I think it's about thinking of what are our own responsibilities, either as data providers or data recipients. It's also thinking about how do we manage data sharing expectations of funders and researchers, because funders are increasingly moving towards the open science movement. Does that meet the needs of researchers or African researchers if we bring that back to home? And how do we ensure access to the benefits of the use of these data? Yeah, and then the last will be benefit sharing. But I think the benefit sharing question goes back to ensuring that is society able to share in the benefits that arise from the use of this genetic data? And the last two slides is just a call for reflection as a stakeholder in African genetic research. So I'll just display two slides. It is to ask yourself, what is first your equity-oriented responsibility? And so whether you're a researcher, what is your equity-oriented responsibility? How do you ensure responsible use first of data stored in genetic databases? And also, how do you ensure that the use of that data yields benefits for society at a much more broader level? And I think for the audience here is to reflect also, as an African researcher, what is your equity-oriented responsibility when you use data in genetic databases, or when you decide to contribute data from your research projects to these databases? What are your responsibilities, both in terms of responsible use and in ensuring that the benefits of the use of that data triggers down to the original donors? And this also applies to funders, to study communities, to policymakers, and more especially to biotech and innovation companies, because I feel like we're not holding them accountable, or the discussion has not yet shifted to that space. I think we've talked about it more and more for researchers, for study communities, but we need to start having a conversation about the equity-oriented responsibilities of biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies when they use data stored in genetic databases. The last point of reflection for me, it's really about decision-making and the use of data stored in these genetic databases, particularly from the perspective of the resource provider. And by the resource provider, I'm talking about the research participant, or that individual, or the public, or that community who provided that information. So should we be sharing, should we be bringing them to the table to be able to say, this is how we want this data to be used, or to be able to tell them that this is how your data has been used? And I think increasingly what we are learning is that we need a much more public-centric approach. It is a stakeholder group that needs to be brought to the table. I think we've gotten to that stage where we need to start engaging the public about the use of genetic data, why it is important to set up genetic databases, what are the governance models, is it in line with their sociocultural beliefs, and all of that. But the question for all of us is, how should the public be engaged? How should we do that? What processes should be used? And even within those processes, how do we go from, because the public is big, how do we even define what is the public? But I think that a public-centric approach to the use of genetic databases is what we should be doing going forward. Great. So with those points of reflection, I just want to thank everyone who's made it to this webinar. Thanks for coming. I also want to thank Dr. Gentina de Vries. She was supposed to do this presentation, and she requested that I do it. So thanks to her for giving me this platform, and to the AfriPubGen team for the invitation. So thank you very much.